Welcome to Walk in the Park. My name is Tony Ingram. This time we're going to go to DeWitt Middle School in Ithaca at what they call their Looking to the Future Day, which is a career day for their 8th grade students. I was asked to give a talk on November 30th, 2012 about careers in parks and recreation. All right, so you can see the 11 park regions. Let's see. Now this is the Finger Lakes region, obviously. And we've got some 27 parks. There might be a couple more. There's one down in Cuyahoga County now that's called Two Rivers. But you can see that it covers quite a large area. And through the Finger Lakes, and they're largely parks on lakes or on gorges. So how many of you have been to Watkins Glen State Park? Okay, a half or so, yeah. How many of you have been to Fairhaven Beach State Park? Yeah, that's a little farther afield. That's way up here in Lake Ontario. So we got a couple of parks up on Lake Ontario. So anyway, just some pictures. The upper left is, that's Watkins Glen. That's Watkins Glen, called Central Cascade. Up in the upper right is what? Teganic Falls, yeah. And down on the bottom,
that's the point. Yeah, that's Point Myers.
It looks a lot like Myers Point, but actually that is Long Point State Park in Aurora. So it's on Cayuga Lake, but it's about 20 miles from here. And a lot of folks in Ithaca don't go up there. I don't know that I ever went there before I started working for the state parks. All right. So not only do we have state parks, but we have historic sites. So this is up near Schenectady area, Johnson Hall. This was the home of William Johnson, who was a Sir William Johnson. He was a British Indian agent, essentially. He had a very good relationship with the Iroquois, and that was his home, and which was taken over during the Revolution. He was, I guess, would have been he wasn't a loyalist, he was a British. He was assigned by Britain, but that is a state historic site. It's a very interesting place. This is in our region, Ganondagan State Historic Site, which is the only state historic site in New York that is dedicated to interpreting the culture and history of Native American people. Yeah, what's a tiger doing in a park? Well, that's actually the Bronx Zoo. So you can think of zoos as parks too. Zoos, botanical gardens, aquariums, places like that.
That's Niagara Falls.
That is Niagara Falls. That's the American Falls on the American side. And this is at Teganic. This fellow sings in the group The Thousands of One, which you may have heard. We have a summer concert series at Teganic during July and August. And then we have beaches. Well, there's beaches on Lake Ontario, but there's beaches on Long Island, beaches all up and down the East Coast. Some of them got slammed pretty hard by the hurricane, actually. So just giving you a little feel for some of the different kinds of parks and activities that go on in them. Of course, camping, car camping, the trail. That's actually Buttermilk Falls right there. Playgrounds. There's a lot of activities. We think of woods, and we think of hiking and camping, that sort of thing, fishing, hunting. But there's a lot of recreational facilities like playgrounds and picnic areas and so forth, and ball fields. So this is actually in a school ground, but we do have ball fields. Some parks are almost exclusively recreation parks, so they'll have, particularly urban parks, they'll have basketball courts, they'll have baseball, might even have a track, things like that. So down in New York City, some of the state parks down there are mainly just recreation facilities. So a lot of different things go on. But around here, we tend to have more natural scenic parks and access to water and scenic resources. So let me just talk a little bit about some of the jobs that are in parks. Of course, there's the summer jobs. So when you get into high school, some of you may want to do some of the summer jobs. You can apply for a summer job in the park. And here's a recreation, or actually a naturalist person. He's a recreation staff person. He's doing some nature activities with kids. Of course, there's lifeguarding. Then actually, these are not summer jobs up here. The upper right is masons. the Finger Lakes region has a lot of stone masonry that was put in the 1930s, particularly some of the 1920s. And they're maintaining that on our gorge trails and bridges and some of the buildings and so forth. That's over in Watkins Glen, where they're building a new staircase entrance to the gorge. And then a picnic area, some old pavilions and so forth. Here's an exciting one right here, which is kind of a seasonal job. It's in the spring, usually in April and May. It's called scaling. And we have to send people down cliffs on ropes, rappelling down ropes with a fireman's pike. This guy has somewhere in there, he has a pole, it's not that visible, but he knocks the loose rock from the cliff off. In the wintertime, water soaks into the shale, freezes and splits it, and then all season long it can come down. And if there's a trail underneath it, that's a pretty significant hazard. So before they can open the trail, the scalers go in and knock the loose rock off. So we have women that do this too. It's not just guys that do this, and it's pretty exciting work. Also very, very hard, exhausting work. And then on the right is a carpenter building a bridge. If you like rock climbing, we had rock climbers get those jobs. Then there's a lot of law enforcement, environmental law and park and recreation law. On the left, this is at Buttermilk Falls, and Rich there is reading the riot act to some gorge pool swimmers, explaining to them that people have drowned in the pool they're just diving into. And he takes it very seriously because he had to pull the body out. So he'd been in Vietnam, but that didn't make it any easier. The guys on the right here, this is up actually at a town park in Cayuga, Harris Park, in the northeast corner of the lake. And there's two Department of Environmental Conservation officers giving these poor guys tickets for not having fishing licenses. So I felt kind of bad for them. These guys were obviously not of substantial means, so some other jobs. So if you want to find out more, a little bit more about parks, you can go to this website, New York State, nysparks.com, employment, parks, whatever, I don't want that other piece off of there, but just employment will get you there. And that'll tell you how you get a summer job. It doesn't list all the jobs, but it'll tell you. There's also permanent civil service jobs. So I was an environmental educator, and I had a civil service job. That means I took an exam, and I qualified, I passed it, and then I got a permanent position. And so those are defined statewide. And there's competitive, we have to take an exam, and then non-competitive, something like a journeyman carpenter or these masons would be non-competitive. They could just be hired and not have to take a civil service exam. But otherwise, there's still civil service. There's a ranger down here. He's probably a seasonal employee. But it's quite a variety of trades. There are professional, technical, and scientific trades. We have a biologist in the region. There's landscape architects, engineers, park police, personnel, human resources management, all that kind of things you have in any kind of agency you have in a park and recreation agency, as well as the people that are out there operating the parks and doing public safety. But there's a lot of other places that you might not think about as parks, and I have a very broad definition of what a park is. And it includes lands managed by the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is different from the Office of Parks. There are state forest lands. You see all the little green areas there. We have quite a lot of them right around here that are managed by the state. These are not parks. Part of their purpose and mission is recreation, and they have trails and they have snowmobiling and things like that, hunting, fishing. But there is logging goes on in them, particularly. Around here, I'd say they're a little more on the recreation end of the scale, but still, you can go out and get a permit to cut firewood and so forth. Here's a program of the state called the Natural Heritage Program, which goes around and tries to map the different biological communities in the state. So here's the state hires some biologists. The federal government does the same thing, and identifies where there are rare plant species, for instance, or a rare animal species, and publishes that information. And also that is used in planning and trying to preserve these ecosystems and particular species. Then the Adirondack Park. This is one of the largest, this is actually the largest state park in the country south of Alaska. And it's over 6 million acres total, up the northeast corner of the state. And I was out in a park in California, Southern California, called Anza Borrego Desert, and the guy in the visitor center was bragging, we have 600,000 acres, the largest state park. And I said, no, we got 6 million acres, and we're in New York. People usually don't think of New York as having a park like this, but you can fit Yellowstone and Yosemite and Grand Canyon, several national parks inside there. But it's not entirely state-owned. There's a line that goes around the region. It's called the Adirondack Blue Line. And then the areas that are green in there, or the various patchwork you can see of different categories of forest land and so forth, that's actually state-owned. And the whole thing is probably only about 40% in state ownership. And this was created in the 1890s and called the Adirondack Forest Preserve. And these lands are forever wild. You can't lumber them, you can't build on them, you can't do anything. You let them be. And that was a big conservation landmark, as it were, back in that time when after the Adirondacks had been terribly abused by loggers. And the folks got together and this sort of set the stage for an interesting place. So the Adirondack Park Agency is sort of a big zoning board that tells people what they can do within the park boundaries consistent with the park goals. The Catskills are similar. They're also a Catskill Forest Preserve, and you can see they actually own state forest preserve lands in there. And some of it's wild forest and some of it's wilderness. There's an aerial picture of the Catskills I took on a flight to New York City. There's another time I went camping and hiking there. But I love the Catskills. They're really amazing little mountain range. And then national forests, as we think of national parks, but there's national forests. And a lot of people don't know the difference between a national forest and a national park. A national forest are lands that are owned by the public through the U.S. Forest Service, which is part of the Department of Agriculture, and they mainly manage timber sales and to have a sustainable yield of forest products, say. Because this, again, was a response to terrible logging practices back in the 1800s that, and we said, wait a minute, we're going to lose our forests and won't have any more forests unless we have the government take over at least some of it and manage it properly. And our local national forest is the Finger Lakes National Forest, in mostly in Seneca and Schuyler County, just west of here. It's about 20 miles from here. And it's the smallest national forest in the system. It's about 16,000 acres, I think, which is big for a park, but small for a national forest. Let's see, national parks. Okay, so there are over 300 national parks spread all across the country. We don't have any big ones around here, but let's see what we got. Okay, upper left is the Grand Canyon, one of the oldest national parks. And to the upper right, again, another old national park is Rocky Mountain in Colorado. And the lower left is Shenandoah National Park. Yes?
I used to live in the Rocky Mountains, actually.
Oh, yeah? Where did you live in the Rocky Mountains?
I lived just above Denver in the woods, so...
Oh, okay. Great. So you weren't that far from Rocky Mountain National Park. You've probably been there, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Several times.
Yeah, yeah.
To the Grand Canyon.
And to the Grand Canyon. Well, good for you. That's great. That's great that you had that opportunity. I
It's
was...
a really cool park.
Hmm?
The Grand Canyon is really cool.
Yeah, I worked in the bottom of the Grand Canyon when I was 21. And I went down there and I worked at Phantom Ranch, which is where the people take the mules down to, and I worked there for part of the summer. 85 cents an hour plus room and board. That's a long time ago. Well, that's when minimum wage was $1.60, so I got 85 cents to put in my pocket. So we are actually in a national park right now, of sorts. We are in the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor. because Cayuga Lake is connected to the Erie Canal, as is Seneca Lake connected to Cayuga Lake and part of the state canal system. We are part of this corridor, which is not owned by the federal government, but it was set up by the federal government in getting local organizations, local parks, and local governments and so forth to collaborate on a corridor that then tries to recreation and education and tourism development collaborate on. And then the upper left, well actually the upper part there is our National Historical Park in Seneca Falls, right there, which is also the headquarters, I think, of our section of the Erie Canalway. Women's Rights National Historical Park. And it's the federal government owns a few buildings, and that's it. And this was the site of the 1848 Women's Rights Convention, which is where the women's rights movement in the United States began. And it's really very, very historically significant. And it wasn't until the next century that women got the right to vote. But very interesting place. If you haven't been there, I recommend it. Then some other federally, well, I won't say they're owned, but they are sort of have an umbrella over is the North Country National Scenic Trail, of which the Finger Lakes Trail is a part. And then there's the Appalachian National Scenic Trail and the Pacific Crest Scenic Trail and the Continental Divide Scenic Trail, National Scenic Trails. So we have another national park type asset in our area. Then there are national wildlife refuges. So a whole system. This is all under Department of Interior as the National Park Service is. And Montezuma at the northern end of the lake is very important for migratory waterfowl, wading birds, shorebirds, things like that, that come down from nesting in Canada and need a place to feed and rest on their trip south. Some of them go down to the Chesapeake Bay and then down maybe the Caribbean, the Atlantic Ocean, and so forth to spend the winter. So going on migration both spring and fall, very vital to have these kinds of places. So you can get work in these kinds of facilities all over the country. Very important for maintaining our wildlife populations, which are in quite a bit of trouble. Then out west, mostly, there's the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, which you can see out in Nevada. Most of the state is owned by the federal government, the Bureau of Land Management, which is a lot of the locals are not very happy about, actually. And that's an agency that oversees the use of federal lands that are not national forests, not national parks, but are areas maybe that mining particularly will go on, or grazing. So they issue permits to people to do those things. It's kind of a controversial agency because of the politics that get involved in some of these decisions about land use. One you wouldn't think of that has some parks is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now our Cayuga Inlet was widened and actually the flood control channel was built back in the late 60s by the Army Corps of Engineers. And they build a lot of dams and canals and that sort of thing. And there's associated lands with them that are parks. So I have a friend who has worked as an environmental educator for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And then the local parks, like Beaver Lake up in just outside of Syracuse in Onondaga County. Yeah, that's a great nature center there, and they have a trail around the lake. Did you? Oh, wow. Then this is Myers Point at Lansing, so the local parks. Ithaca Falls is a tiny little park that's I think it's owned by the city of Ithaca now, but farther upstream it's Cornell, and of course the city park at Stewart Park. So there's local parks, state parks, national forests, and many other kinds. Then there are preserves that are owned by conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy. They find ecologically important areas and then will raise funds to buy them and protect them, and sometimes turn them over to government agencies to run as preserves. I was just in one down in Virginia, North Carolina, that they did that with. They turned it over to Fish and Wildlife. And then our own Finger Lakes Land Trust, which has Lick Brook Preserve, Sweedler Preserve at Lick Brook, which is in the town of Ithaca, and then there's some along the lake and Skinny Atlas Lake up there. So all over the Finger Lakes region is, the land trusts. Cornell Plantations has a lot of land that it manages, a lot of preserves, natural areas, and botanical gardens and that, arboretum and so forth. So our gorges, the Cascadilla Gorge and Fall Creek Gorge, are Cornell Plantations. Then there's one along the lake here. I think it's the Edwards Lake Cliff Preserve. And then there are environmental organizations that you can work for. Probably the most famous and the oldest is the Sierra Club. And that was started by a guy named John Muir. If you live in California, you know who John Muir was. He was one of the great conservationists of the 1800s, and he founded the Sierra Club, and he was said to be the father of our national park system. He really was one of the most influential people in the creation of our national parks. There's a lot of different kinds of organizations that you could call environmental organizations. The Cayuga Lake Watershed Network, one right here in this area, that works on proper, sustainable use of our lake in its watershed. Ducks Unlimited. Now, there's some organizations, conservation organizations, that are set up by hunters. And the duck hunters realized, hey, if you destroy all the wetlands, we have no ducks, and we like to hunt ducks. So they're actually big supporters of things like wildlife refuges.
Save ducks to kill them. Save ducks to kill them.
Yeah, the people can have mixed feelings about that, but they do a lot of conservation work, and there's a National Shooting Sports Foundation. They like to shoot, but hunters are a big lobby for conservation, and the best thing that environmental organizations can do is create partnerships with hunting and fishing and groups that also care about the survival of our environment. So then 350.org, some of you may have heard of that. That's a global climate change activist organization, which is trying to keep us from going over the cliff on that issue. Earth Day Networks, works on Earth Day every year. It's been going on since 1970. Here's the New York Forest Owners Association. Now, they are into forest conservation, but for good silviculture practices, which means, forestry practices on your own land and so forth. They're not the ones that are going to protect old growth forests. So, they want to cut those trees. So they're not all on the same page, but there are things that they do for conservation. Friends of the Earth was sort of a spin-off from the Sierra Club some years ago. So the Natural Resources Defense Council actually goes out and fights legal battles to protect our land and air and water and wildlife and so forth. So you get that. Then there are environmental education organizations that New York State Outdoor Education Association, the North American Association for Environmental Education, and I've been very active in the National Association for Interpretation. What the heck is that? Well, it's the interpretation of our natural and cultural heritage, like in national parks and state parks and historic sites and museums and botanical gardens and so forth. So you can get certified as an interpretive guide to, then that will help you get employment and maybe get better salary and so forth. It creates professional standards and that sort of thing. So there's a difference between environmental education and interpretation. Interpretation is usually on site at a place like a national park or a historic site or something like that, and you're telling a story relating to that place or to that historic event or person. That's interpretation. Whereas, so that was personal interpretation there. This is what you'd call, well, you're not actually going on a hike with somebody, but you're seeing an exhibit sign up by Teganic Falls or in a visitor's center, or you got a cell phone guided tour, and you call into this number and push a number, and a guide comes on and tells you about where you are, and bookstores and so forth. Interpretive center. So this would be like a visitor center that would further interpret the park or the historic site, and that sort of thing. And the nature centers are more the environmental education end of things, where you're not specifically dealing with, say, a scenic resource or a historic event or something like that, but rather you're learning more about outdoors, about nature, about it will be related to the place you're in, certainly, but you're going to learn more things, about plants and animals and insects and ecosystems and that sort of thing. All right, so we'll just back up to that one. So, are there any questions? We have a few minutes for questions.
It's the tree house.
Yeah, that's treetops at Cayuga Nature Center. Yeah. Yes.
Which state has the most national parks?
Good question. Which state has the most national parks? California jumps to mind. I'll bet California is right up there. Alaska's a big leader too. Alaska has a bunch of national parks. Most people don't get to the Alaska National Parks for obvious reasons. They're in very remote areas and it's hard to get to Alaska in the first place, and then some of them are like you can only fly into. But California has, oh man, it has a bunch. In the Sierra Nevada mountains, there's 4 or 5 or 6. There's the Redwoods National Park. There's Muir Woods. There's Sequoia, Kings Canyon, Yosemite, Death Valley. There's a lot. Arizona has quite a few. In the east, we don't have as many national parks because there's more people. There's been a high population here longer. The lands were owned by people since the 1800s and so forth by settlers and so forth, and there wasn't a national park system. When the national park system was created, it was first of all created in the West around some of our spectacular scenery, and that was the idea. We don't have the great cathedrals and castles of Europe, but we have spectacular landscape. So that was sort of part of the justification for creating national parks. And the lands out west, there were a lot more public lands already. They hadn't been all settled, and so they were easier for the federal government to create them on lands that were already publicly owned. Anybody want to get a job in a park? Oh, yes. Yes.
Well, I was going to ask that. Like, can you get a job in a park as when you turn 16 or
Yeah. Go on that website I showed you, nysparks.com/employment.
Yeah, I wrote it down.
Yeah, go on there, and they'll tell you. There's a whole page on how do you get a job in a park, and the seasonal jobs and permanent jobs. But yeah, you can get a job. There you go.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.